plants that really engage all of the senses. And depending on who your client is, the population that you're designing for, and who's going to enjoy that garden, different senses are more important than others, but I like to at least consider all of them. So we're going to start with plants with fragrance. And, we could be here all night talking about it. I'm sure you guys have your top few, but I included some that I think are really staples in some of my designs for a lot of reasons. So I've included lilac, evoking memories, that feeling of nostalgia. Almost everybody has a lilac story. The scent alone just, brings back memories of childhood for some people. It's gorgeous. So definitely more than just the olfactory, feature of it. It's a beautiful shrub, and I encourage everybody to try to find a space. There's some great new varieties that are a little bit smaller than the old-fashioned ones. So I think each, I don't think I design any spaces that I don't try to sneak at least one lilac in. When I'm looking at designing a space, I'm not just looking at choosing plants for the garden. I'm also choosing plants that you can use in programming. And so a lot of these are really important plants when you are doing HT work. And we know that getting supplies for a program is a lot of work and can cost a lot of money. And if you can have it built right into your garden space, why wouldn't you? It offsets all those costs, and you can make that part of the activity. If you have, let's say, a very, very active senior in long-term care, you can bring them out one-on-one. Let's cut some lavender for today's program. And so you can make it an add-on. It's pretty amazing if you can actually incorporate that into programming. So those are three of my favorites for fragrance. The list is very, very long, of course, but those are three just to kind of get the juices flowing. I wanted to talk a little bit about aromatherapy. And depending on where you work, you might have an aromatherapist on staff, or maybe that comes in and works with some of your residents or patients. And there's a whole list of things that are very, very safe, that don't interact with medications because it's all done through inhalation. And I think at the very least, again, we had an aromatherapist that would come in and do some work with the seniors at the long-term care facility. And, they loved it. They loved the one-on-one. They loved the relaxation of smelling some of these plants. And I think as far as a treatment that they were receiving, it was always gentle and enjoyable for them. So they maybe saw some of these, I want to say cure, but not cure, but basically relief from symptoms. But more than that, it was a relaxation and an enjoyable experience for them. So let's move to tactile plants. And this is one that I think a lot of people forget about, and they're really easy to incorporate. Pussy willow is always on my list. And it ends up being on almost every list because, again, talk about a plant that evokes memories. Everybody has a pussy willow story. They were so plentiful, say 50 years ago. And, I don't know how many stories I've heard of bouquets cut for moms and grandmas. And it's just a lovely thing, even for somebody who maybe is not able to participate fully in a program. If you place a pussy willow in their hand, they will stroke it, they will hold it. It's wonderful to sort of watch. So I've listed some others here: lamb's ear, bunnytail grass. That's a fun one, I think, especially if you're working with children's groups. Dusty miller. And again, a lot of these things can be used in programming, even if it's just a sensory program where they're just touching and talking about the names of things. But in the garden, I think it's really important to make sure that these are accessible. So sitting next to or planted next to a seating area, or maybe at an entrance and exit, maybe planted almost too close to the pathway so that people actually brush up against it or interact with it. It does no good to put them in the back because then you use that sensory experience. So it's always something that I sort of consider both in the garden and for programming.
Globe thistle, globe thistle.
Oh,
I
yes.
One of my favorites. I had a really cool tactile experience with my 4-year-old when we got home from preschool. We were feeling the spiky flower head before the flowers emerge. It's hard and spiky. And now the flowers have emerged, and some of them were hard and spiky, and some of them were soft, and she called them fluffy. And so we were having
Yes.
a lot of fun, like touching the hard, spiky ones and the soft, fluffy ones. I'd never really thought of globe thistle as a tactile plant before, but it's a very cool one. At least it was a great experience with my little one today.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing that. And it actually brings to mind, I had two volunteers that worked with me that were sight impaired, and that's really how they saw flowers go from bud to bloom. Just that difference in the feel of them, and it helped them visualize, what the flower actually appeared like without sight. They could just feel that difference. So yeah, it's wonderful and very powerful.
Mhm.
So other plants that are auditory, I think that kind of stimulate, that sense, grasses for sure, especially if you're not too tidy of a gardener and you let them kind of go and be tall in the fall and sway in the breeze. There are lots of trees. Again, the wind kind of rustling through trees. Beech and oak are wonderful ones because they retain their leaves for a long time. And I know when my kids were small, they would call our beech tree the whispering tree, because they thought when the wind rustled that it just was whispering to them. And it's interesting when you work with children, they bring your attention to things that we as adults miss, those small things. I just read an article published at London University, and they were talking about the power of birdsong, which again is incorporated into a therapeutic space by planting some bird plants, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. But again, that auditory interest and the ability of birdsong or wind through trees to relax somebody is pretty powerful. So definitely one to sort of keep in mind, even if, like, a lot of people consider grasses maybe less therapeutic, they've got some of those qualities, I think. Tasty plants. And I love to sort of save space for edible plants along a pathway or in planters. I incorporate them in with the flowers and encourage people to use them. So definitely at the hospice, we did a lot of herb plantings, a lot of tomato plantings, and they used them in the kitchen. But definitely the people in long-term care would walk the path, and they knew. We had one fellow, he would be out there at dawn, like as soon as you could like see daylight, and he was out there in the strawberry patch. And in fact, people started complaining because Sid got all of the strawberries. But it was wonderful. It was a surprise along the walk that they could find something and taste it. And we would laugh at visitors who think that they're stealing, and they look around like, will anybody notice if I steal that perfectly red tomato? And then they realize that everybody is, and that's the whole point of it. So, you think about including some of those plants again for interest and for fun, and to engage people in the garden and what you've got there. And then we don't want to lose sight of just the power of beauty. Even if a plant has no other therapeutic characteristics, the sight of a wisteria in full bloom, the awe of that, is very humbling, and I think can put problems into perspective and create joy very easily just by looking upon beauty. So I never want to dismiss that sense, even if, like I say, even if a plant maybe has no other therapeutic characteristics, it's still therapy to look on beauty. I think particularly when I'm designing for hospice care, there is great power to know that someone on their last day is looking upon beauty. I think we all deserve that. I do want to touch on culturally familiar plants, even knowing that we're from all over the place And so for each of us, it may be different. Um, in my region, our neighbors at Six Nations were definitely part of our hospice territory and family that we took care of. And so we included a lot of culturally familiar plants that were medicines for them, and we encouraged them to go out. I loved the surprise when a new family came in and saw that we had provided plants that they could harvest and use as medicines while they took care of their loved one. Um, we've got sweetgrass here, the ceremonial tobacco, and white pine, so Pinus strobus. And this is sort of, I think, where I break my rule on plants that maybe require a little extra care. So if anybody's ever grown sweetgrass, you know it runs like a son of a gun. And so we just know that going in, when I propose it to a client, that's sort of known that that plant is going to require some special care. Oh, it runs like a son of a gun. And so we just know that going in, when I propose it to a client, that's sort of known that that plant is going to require some special care. I do usually plant it in a pot in the ground, and that kind of keeps it at bay a little bit. The ceremonial tobacco is a great example of a plant that spreads seed far and wide. And so this year you'll have 3 plants, and next year you'll have 300. But again, you know, I think as long as the whole garden is not full of those plants, you can manage some of them. I think that because it's culturally significant, it's worth the extra work to have it there. And what we started doing is potting up the little seedlings and making them available if people wanted to try them in their own gardens, giving them away. Ceremonial tobacco is never sold, it's always given as a gift. And so it was our way to sort of share that with the community. So that was our way of managing sort of an unruly plant in the garden.